I graduated at the top of my executive MBA program after 4 years of studying while working full-time, 4 years of sleepless nights and impossible sacrifices. And when I called my mother to confirm she was coming, she told me she had other plans. My brother was hosting a backyard barbecue. Nothing special. No occasion, just a casual weekend gathering with his friends, and my entire family decided that was more important than the biggest achievement of my life. When I asked my father if he could at least come alone, he said the words I will never forget. "Don't be dramatic, Evelyn. It's just a ceremony." I sat in that auditorium surrounded by hundreds of families hugging and crying and celebrating, and the 2 seats I had reserved for my parents were completely empty. No one clapped just for me. No one took photos. No one said they were proud. And when my mother called me that night, she did not say congratulations. She said, "The barbecue was so much fun, too bad you couldn't be here." That was the moment something inside me finally broke, but not in the way they expected. I did not scream. I did not cry. I did not beg for their love anymore. Instead, I made a decision that would change everything. A decision that would expose secrets my mother had been hiding for 20 years. A decision that would tear apart the family dynamic they had so carefully protected. And a decision that would leave them begging for my attention while I simply walked away. If you think you know where this story is going, I promise you you do not. Stay with me until the end. My name is Evelyn Carter. I am 38 years old, and for most of my life, I have been the invisible daughter. I built a career in corporate finance, earned promotions that no one in my family knows about, and learned to celebrate my own victories in silence because no one ever asked what I was celebrating. That was the unspoken rule in the Carter household. Everything revolved around my younger brother Daniel, and I was simply expected to understand. I left home 15 years ago, not with anger, but with quiet resignation. I moved across the country, found my footing in a competitive industry, and slowly built something I could be proud of. I paid my own rent, bought my own car, saved for my own future. When I got promoted to senior analyst, I did not call home because I already knew what would happen. My mother would say, "That's nice, dear," and then spend 20 minutes telling me about Daniel's new apartment, or Daniel's new girlfriend, or Daniel's latest project that was surely going to make him successful someday. My father would stay silent in the background, maybe grunt a brief acknowledgement, and that would be the end of it. So I stopped sharing. I stopped expecting. I learned to be my own audience. The dynamic in my family was never subtle. My mother, Margaret, had decided long ago that Daniel was the priority. He was the baby, the son, the one who needed support. I was the responsible one, the one who figured things out, the one who did not require attention. My father, Robert, had a different role. He kept the peace. Whenever I tried to express frustration or hurt, he would cut me off with the same phrase he had used my entire life. "Don't make this into something it isn't. You're overreacting. Let it go." After years of hearing those words, I did exactly what he wanted. I let it go. I let all of it go, including the hope that he would ever stand up for me. There is a memory I have never been able to shake. When I was 18, I discovered that a university overseas had a study abroad program I desperately wanted to join. I asked my mother if I could apply, and she told me flatly that we could not afford it and that I had not received any scholarship anyway. I believed her. I had no reason not to. I stayed home, went to a local college, and watched Daniel get whatever he asked for without question. I never brought it up again, but somewhere deep inside, I always wondered if there was more to that story than she told me. There is another memory, darker and more complicated. 15 years ago, I accidentally discovered that my parents were on the verge of divorce. I found documents, heard whispered arguments, saw my mother's packed suitcase hidden in the closet. I was terrified. I went to my father and begged him to stay, begged him to keep the family together. He looked at me with tired eyes and said he would try. He stayed. But something in him died after that. He became a shadow in his own home present, but never truly there, agreeing with my mother on everything because fighting required energy he no longer had. I saved their marriage, or at least I thought I did. What I did not realize was that I had also sealed my own fate as the daughter who would never be fought for. When I decided to pursue my executive MBA 4 years ago, I did it entirely on my own. I worked full-time, studied at night, sacrificed weekends and holidays and sleep. I told my family I was busy, and they never asked with what. But as graduation approached, something in me shifted. I wanted them there. I needed them there. For once in my life, I wanted to stand on that stage and see my family in the audience clapping for me, proud of me. So I did something I had never done before. I booked their flights. I reserved their hotel rooms. I sent formal invitations with the date and time carefully written out. I called my mother and said the words I had never said, "This is important to me. Please come." She said yes. She promised. And for a brief, foolish moment, I believed that this time would be different. 1 week before my graduation, I called my mother to confirm the travel arrangements. I had sent her the flight itinerary twice, the hotel confirmation 3 times, and a detailed schedule of the ceremony with the exact time I would walk across the stage. I wanted everything to be perfect. I wanted there to be no excuse, no confusion, no reason for them not to show up. When she answered the phone, her voice had that distracted quality I had learned to recognize over the years, the tone that meant she was only half listening, the tone that meant something else had already claimed her attention. "About the graduation," I began, keeping my voice steady. "Your flight leaves Friday morning. I can pick you up from the airport and drive you to the hotel before the ceremony on Saturday." There was a pause, a long pause, and in that silence I felt something cold settle in my chest. "Oh, Evelyn," she said, and I knew from those 2 words that everything I had planned was about to collapse. "We've been meaning to talk to you about that. Daniel is hosting a barbecue this weekend. You know how rare it is for him to do something like this. He's been so busy with work, and he finally has time to bring the family together. Your father and I think we should be there to support him." I could not speak. I could not breathe. A barbecue. A casual, meaningless, last-minute barbecue with no occasion, no purpose, no significance whatsoever, and my mother had decided that it was more important than the culmination of 4 years of my life. "Mom," I said, slowly, forcing myself to stay calm, "I booked your flights. I reserved your rooms. This is my graduation. I told you how much this means to me." "I know, sweetheart, but Daniel rarely hosts anything. We need to show him we support his efforts. You understand, don't you? You've always been the understanding one." I wanted to scream. I wanted to ask her why Daniel's effort to grill hamburgers for his friends was more valuable than my effort to earn a graduate degree while working full-time for 4 years. I wanted to demand an explanation, a justification, anything that would make this make sense. But before I could find the words, I heard my father's voice in the background, and then he was on the phone. "Evelyn, don't be dramatic," he said, his tone flat and dismissive. "It's just a ceremony. They'll mail you the diploma anyway. You don't need us there to watch you walk across a stage." Just a ceremony. 4 years of sacrifice reduced to 3 words. I heard laughter in the background, Daniel's laughter, loud and careless, the sound of someone who had never had to fight for anything in his life. He was there with them. He knew about my graduation. He knew they were canceling on me, and he was laughing. "I understand," I whispered into the phone. "Good," my mother said, relief flooding her voice. "I knew you would. You've always been so mature about these things. We'll call you after the ceremony. Okay, tell us how it goes." She hung up before I could respond. I sat there holding the phone, staring at nothing, feeling something inside me crack open and bleed. But the tears did not come. Not yet. Instead, a memory surfaced unbidden and sharp. A memory I had buried so deep I had almost convinced myself it never happened. I was 25 years old, sitting alone in my tiny apartment crying because I could not afford the tuition payment that was due in 2 weeks. I had been working 2 jobs, saving every penny, and I was still short. I had called my mother earlier that day to ask for help, and she had sighed heavily and said they simply did not have the money right now, that times were tight, that I needed to figure it out on my own like I always did. That night, I sat on the floor of my bedroom and sobbed, feeling more alone than I had ever felt in my life. And then I saw it, a shadow under my door. Someone was standing there listening. The shadow stayed for 10 seconds, maybe more, and then it walked away without a word. I knew it was Daniel. He was visiting that weekend. He heard me crying. He knew I was struggling. And the next morning I watched him ask my mother for $500 to go out with his friends for the weekend. She gave it to him without hesitation, pulled the cash right out of her purse and pressed it into his hand with a smile. He looked at me as he took it. He looked right at me, and he said nothing. He knew. He always knew, and he never cared. The day of my graduation arrived with cruel, perfect weather. The sun was bright, the sky was clear, and the auditorium was filled with families dressed in their finest clothes, clutching flowers and cameras and handmade signs with their loved ones' names. I walked in alone. I found my seat among the other graduates and looked up at the section where families were gathered. The 2 seats I had reserved were empty. They would stay empty for the entire ceremony. But I was not completely alone. Linda Harris, my colleague and closest friend, had driven 3 hours to be there. She sat in the family section, one familiar face in a sea of strangers, and when I looked up at her, she gave me a small, sad smile that said, "Everything words could not." She knew what this meant. She knew what it cost me to be there without them. When my name was called, I walked across that stage with my head held high. I shook the dean's hand, accepted my diploma, and smiled for the official photograph. But there was no roar of applause from a proud family. There was no one shouting my name. There was only the polite, generic clapping of an audience full of people who did not know me and the silence where my parents' voices should have been. After the ceremony, my phone rang. It was my mother. "Evelyn, the barbecue was so much fun. Daniel grilled the most amazing steaks and everyone had such a wonderful time. Your aunt said it was the best family gathering we've had in years. Too bad you couldn't be here." She did not say congratulations. She did not ask how the ceremony went. She did not acknowledge that I had just achieved something I had worked toward for 4 years. She talked about steaks. She talked about Daniel. She talked about everything except me. "I understand," I said quietly. "I knew you would, sweetheart. You always do." She hung up. And I stood there in my graduation gown, surrounded by happy families, taking photographs, holding a diploma that suddenly felt worthless in my hands. But this time, something was different. This time, the words "I understand" did not mean what they had always meant. They did not mean acceptance. They did not mean forgiveness. They did not mean I would swallow my pain and pretend everything was fine. This time, they meant goodbye. The goodbye was not loud. It was not dramatic. It was not the kind of confrontation my family might have expected from someone they had dismissed as too sensitive for so many years. Instead, it was quiet, methodical, and absolute. In the weeks following my graduation, I did not call my mother to argue. I did not send angry emails or leave tearful voicemails demanding an apology. I simply stopped being available. I changed my phone number. I began using my middle name professionally, a small adjustment that made me harder to find for anyone who might come looking. I stopped the monthly transfers I had been quietly sending to help with my parents' expenses money they never acknowledged and probably assumed came from somewhere else. I removed myself from their lives the same way they had removed me from their priorities, without announcement, without explanation, without giving them the chance to talk me out of it. For the first few weeks, they did not even notice. That fact alone confirmed everything I had already known. My absence was so normal to them, so expected, that it took nearly a month before my mother realized she could not reach me. When she finally tried calling my old number and found it disconnected, she assumed it was a technical problem. When her emails went unanswered, she assumed I was busy with work. When the monthly deposits stopped appearing in their account, she assumed the bank had made an error. It never occurred to her that I had chosen to leave. It never occurred to any of them that the daughter they had taken for granted might one day decide she had given enough. I learned later through distant relatives who still spoke to me occasionally how my family interpreted my silence. My mother told people I was going through a phase, that I was upset about something trivial, that I would come around eventually because I always did. "She'll call back in a few weeks," she reportedly said at a family dinner. "Evelyn just needs time to cool down. You know how she gets." My brother Daniel was even more dismissive. "She's always been dramatic," he told anyone who asked. "She'll get over it." My father said nothing at all, but according to my aunt, Something in his eyes had changed. He looked older, she said. He looked like a man who was beginning to understand that some doors once closed do not open again. 3 months after my graduation, I received a message on LinkedIn from a woman named Patricia Moore. The name was vaguely familiar, a ghost from my childhood, someone I remembered seeing at my mother's social gatherings decades ago. Her message was warm and congratulatory. She had read an article about me receiving a Women in Leadership award from a regional business organization, and she wanted to reach out and tell me how proud she was to see what I had accomplished. She mentioned that she and my mother had been close friends when I was young, and she asked if I might be willing to meet for coffee sometime to catch up. I almost declined. I had no interest in reconnecting with anyone from my mother's world. But something about her message felt genuine, so I agreed to meet her at a small cafe near my office. Patricia was 70 years old now, silver-haired and sharp-eyed, with the kind of direct manner that comes from a lifetime of not suffering fools. We talked about my career, my award, my plans for the future, and then almost casually she said something that stopped my heart. "I always wondered," she said, stirring her tea slowly, "did you ever get that scholarship?" I stared at her. "What scholarship?" Patricia frowned, confused by my confusion. "When you were 18, your mother showed me a letter that came for you. It was from a university, a prestigious one, a full scholarship for their study abroad program. Your mother was so excited. She said she was going to give it to you that evening." She paused, studying my face. "A week later, she told everyone you didn't qualify, that the letter had been a mistake. I thought it was strange at the time, but I didn't ask questions. It wasn't my place." I could not speak. I could not move. 20 years of my life rearranged themselves in an instant, puzzle pieces clicking into place with horrible, perfect clarity. The scholarship had been real. It had existed. And my mother had hidden it from me, lied to me, told me I had no opportunities when the opportunity of a lifetime had been sitting in her hands. She had stolen my future to keep me home. She had sabotaged my dreams so I would stay close, so I would be available, so I would be there to help raise Daniel while she focused all her attention on him. "I never saw that letter," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "She told me there was no scholarship. She told me we couldn't afford it." I believed her. Patricia's face went pale. "Oh, Evelyn, I am so sorry. I had no idea." I thanked her for telling me the truth. I finished my coffee with hands that would not stop trembling. And when I left that cafe, I felt something I had not expected to feel. Not anger, not even grief, just a cold, clear understanding of exactly who my mother was and exactly what she had done to me. 1 month later, I stood on a stage in front of 300 people and accepted my Women in Leadership award. The ceremony was covered by local media, and when the reporter asked me to say a few words, I spoke from the heart. "I am grateful to everyone who believed in me," I said, looking directly into the camera. "I am grateful to the mentors who guided me, the colleagues who supported me, and the friends who never let me give up. I am especially grateful to everyone who believed in me when the people who should have believed in me the most did not." The audience applauded. The reporter smiled. And somewhere across the country, my mother saw that article. I know she saw it because her neighbors saw it too. They called her, stopped her at the grocery store, mentioned it at church. "Your daughter is so accomplished. Why don't you ever mention her? You must be so proud." And for the first time in her life, Margaret Carter had no answer. She could not brag about a daughter she had not spoken to in months. She could not take credit for achievements she had never supported. She could not explain why her successful award-winning daughter had apparently erased her from her life without a word. I did not punish my family. I did not seek revenge or demand justice or make them pay for what they had done. I simply removed myself from the equation. I locked the door to my life and did not leave them a key. They would have to live with my absence the same way I had lived with their indifference, quietly, permanently, and without any hope of resolution. And that, as they would soon discover, was the worst punishment of all. The months that followed were quiet for me, but devastating for them. I did not watch their downfall with satisfaction. I did not track their misery or celebrate their pain. I simply lived my life, built my career, and let the consequences of their choices unfold without my interference. But I heard things. Through distant relatives, through Patricia Moore, through the inevitable gossip that travels through families whether you want it to or not. And what I heard confirmed what I had always suspected: the structure of the Carter family had been built on my invisible labor, and without me holding it together, it began to collapse. Margaret's unraveling started at church. Patricia Moore, who had reconnected with my mother's social circle after our coffee meeting, attended a gathering where several women were discussing their children's accomplishments. When the conversation turned to me, Patricia asked a simple question that my mother could not answer. "Margaret, I saw Evelyn's award in the newspaper. She's done so well for herself. You must be so proud. When did you last speak to her?" My mother, according to Patricia, went pale. She stammered something about busy schedules and demanding careers, but her discomfort was obvious. The other women exchanged glances. They had known Margaret for decades. They had listened to her talk endlessly about Daniel's potential, Daniel's projects, Daniel's future. They had rarely heard her mention me at all. And now, faced with evidence that her forgotten daughter had achieved something remarkable, Margaret had nothing to say. The rumors spread slowly at first, then faster. People began to ask questions. Why had Margaret never mentioned Evelyn's success? Why did she seem unable to contact her own daughter? What kind of mother loses touch with a child who was clearly thriving? Margaret tried to control the narrative. She called old friends to explain, to justify, to spin the story in her favor. But no one wanted to listen. The women who had once admired her began to distance themselves. Invitations to social events stopped arriving. Phone calls went unanswered. The respect she had cultivated over a lifetime evaporated not through scandal or confrontation, but through the quiet withdrawal of people who no longer believed her version of events. She had spent years positioning herself as the devoted mother, the sacrificing parent, the woman who held her family together. Now, everyone could see the truth: she had sacrificed the wrong child, and she had lost her forever. Daniel's reckoning came in a different form. He had coasted through life on charm and family support, never developing the skills to handle real problems on his own. When he made a serious mistake at work, the kind of error that required careful navigation and strategic thinking, he did what he had always done: he looked for someone else to fix it. But I was gone. My mother was too old and too distracted by her own social collapse to help. And for the first time in his 35 years of life, Daniel had to face the consequences of his own incompetence alone. He panicked. He made the situation worse. His employer lost confidence in him. He was not fired, but he was demoted, quietly moved to a position where he could do less damage. His wife, who had watched this pattern repeat throughout their marriage, finally reached her breaking point. "You are 35 years old," she said, according to what I later heard from relatives. "Why do you still need your mother for everything? Why can't you handle anything on your own?" She did not file for divorce. She simply moved out, took space, made it clear that she would not return until he became the man she had thought she married. Daniel, for the first time in his life, was truly alone. 9 months after my graduation, I received a phone call that surprised me. It was Linda Harris, my closest friend and the only person I had left any bridge open for. "Your father contacted me," she said carefully. "He asked if I could give him your number. He said he just wants to talk. He's not asking you to forgive anyone. He just wants to see you once." I had told Linda months earlier that if my father ever reached out, and only my father, she could share my contact information. I had not expected him to actually do it. My father had spent his entire life avoiding difficult conversations. The fact that he had made this effort meant something, though I was not sure what. We met at a quiet coffee shop far from anywhere my mother might find us. He looked older than I remembered, grayer, more fragile. He did not try to hug me or make small talk. He sat down across from me, ordered a coffee he would not drink, and spoke the words I had waited my entire life to hear. "I knew you deserved better," he said quietly. I always knew. I felt something twist in my chest. "Then why didn't you do anything?" He did not make excuses. He did not blame my mother, or claim he had no choice. He looked at me with tired eyes and told me the truth. "Because I was a coward. I could have left. I could have spoken up. I could have stood in front of you and told your mother that what she was doing was wrong. But I chose the easy way. I chose silence. I let you carry burdens that were never yours to carry, and I told myself that staying quiet was the same as keeping the peace. It wasn't. It was betrayal. And now I'm paying for it. He did not cry. He did not ask for forgiveness. He just sat there staring at his coffee as it grew cold, and I understood that this was all he was capable of giving. He had no grand gestures left. He had no way to undo the decades of damage. He could only sit across from his daughter and finally admit what they both already knew. He had failed me. He had chosen comfort over courage, and there was nothing left to say. I did not tell him I forgave him because I was not sure I did, but I did not leave in anger either. I simply finished my coffee, told him I appreciated his honesty, and walked away. It was more closure than I had ever expected to receive from anyone in my family. 1 year after my graduation, my mother fell ill. It was nothing life-threatening, but she needed care, needed help, needed someone to be there for her the way she had never been there for me. For the first time in her life, she called me directly. I do not know how she got my new number. Perhaps my father gave it to her. Perhaps she found it through some other means. It did not matter. I was sitting in my apartment drinking coffee and watching the morning light spread across the city when my phone buzzed on the table. I looked at the screen. I saw her name, and I felt nothing. No anger, no satisfaction, no grief. Just the quiet recognition that this person who had shaped so much of my pain no longer had any power over me. The phone rang, and rang, and rang. I watched it until the ringing stopped. Then I placed it face down on the table, picked up my coffee, and continued watching the sunrise. I did not call her back. I did not send a message explaining why. I simply let her call go unanswered the same way she had let my needs go unmet for 38 years. It was not revenge. Revenge would require anger, and I had none left. It was simply that Margaret Carter no longer mattered to me. She had spent a lifetime teaching me that I was not important. I had finally learned the lesson, and now for the first time, she was the one who was invisible. She would learn in the silence that followed that the scariest thing in the world was not being hated. It was being forgotten. A year passed, then another. And somewhere along the way, I stopped counting the days since I had last spoken to my family. Time moved differently now. It moved forward instead of in circles. It carried me toward new things instead of dragging me back to old wounds. I woke up each morning without the weight of resentment on my chest. I went to sleep each night without replaying conversations that had hurt me decades ago. I had spent 38 years trying to earn a place in a family that had already decided I did not belong there. Now finally, I had stopped trying. And in that surrender, I found something I had never expected to find. I found peace. My career continued to rise. The Women in Leadership Award opened doors I had not known existed, connected me with mentors and colleagues who saw my potential and wanted to help me reach it. I was promoted twice in 18 months. I was invited to speak at conferences to mentor young women who reminded me of myself, to build something meaningful in a world that had finally started to recognize my worth. But the greatest gift of that year was not professional. It was personal. It was Linda Harris who had driven 3 hours to sit with me at my graduation when my own parents could not be bothered to show up. Linda became my closest friend, my chosen sister, the family I had always deserved but never had. We spent holidays together. We celebrated each other's victories. We held each other through difficult times. And when people asked about my family, I told them the truth. My family was small, but it was mine. And it was built on love instead of obligation. I heard through the same distant channels that had kept me informed before about what happened to the people I had left behind. My mother's social collapse was complete. The women who had once admired her now avoided her. The friends who had once sought her company now made excuses when she called. She spent her days alone in a house that felt too large, surrounded by photographs of a family that no longer existed. She had believed for so many years that motherhood granted her ownership over her children. She had believed that love meant control, that sacrifice meant martyrdom, that her needs would always come first because she had given us life. She learned too late that none of those beliefs were true. She learned that children are not possessions. She learned that love cannot be demanded or forced. She learned that the door she had slammed in my face so many times would not open again just because she finally decided to knock. By the time she understood what she had lost, there was no one left who wanted to hear her regrets. Daniel's wife filed for legal separation 6 months after she moved out. She cited irreconcilable differences, but everyone knew the truth. She had married a man who had never been required to grow up, and she had finally stopped waiting for him to change. At 36 years old, Daniel was forced to learn what most people learn at 20, how to pay his own bills, solve his own problems, take responsibility for his own failures. He struggled. He made mistakes. He called our mother for help, but she was too consumed by her own misery to offer much support. For the first time in his life, Daniel Carter had to stand on his own 2 feet. I do not know if he ever managed it. I stopped asking. My father sent me a letter. It arrived on a Tuesday afternoon, handwritten on plain paper, postmarked from the town where I grew up. I recognized his handwriting immediately, the careful, deliberate script of a man who had spent his life choosing his words with caution. I opened it expecting an apology, a plea for reconciliation, another attempt to pull me back into the family I had escaped. Instead, I found something different. He did not ask for forgiveness. He did not beg me to return. He simply asked me to understand. He wrote about his marriage, about the years of silence, about the slow death of his spirit, as he chose peace over principle again and again. He wrote about watching me grow up knowing I deserved better and hating himself for never giving it to me. He wrote about the day I begged him to stay, how he had wanted to tell me the truth, but could not find the words. He wrote about regret. He wrote about love. He wrote about the distance between who he wanted to be and who he actually was. I read the letter once, then folded it carefully and placed it in a drawer. I did not reply. I did not throw it away. I did not burn it in some ceremonial act of closure. I simply kept it a reminder of the father I had lost long before I ever walked away. That was the only grace I had left to give. People ask me sometimes if I regret cutting off my family. They ask if I feel guilty if I miss them, if I wish things had been different. The answer is complicated. I do not regret my decision because my decision saved my life. I do not feel guilty because I did not abandon them. I simply stopped abandoning myself. I do miss them sometimes, but I miss the family I wished they had been, not the family they actually were. And yes, I wish things had been different. I wish my mother had loved me the way I needed to be loved. I wish my father had found the courage to stand up for me. I wish my brother had seen me as a sister instead of a competitor. But wishing does not change the past. It only keeps you trapped there. And I am done being trapped. I have learned things in the years since I walked away. I have learned that sacrifice which is not valued is not virtue. It is self-abandonment. I have learned that silence does not mean weakness. Sometimes it means you have finally chosen yourself. I have learned that boundaries are not cruelty. They are the most powerful form of self-love. I have learned that you cannot make people see your worth by proving it over and over again. You can only recognize your own worth and walk away from those who refuse to see it. This morning, I stood by my apartment window and watched the sun rise over the city. The sky was painted in shades of gold and pink, and the streets below were just beginning to stir with life. My phone buzzed on the table beside me. I glanced at the screen. It was my mother's number. She still calls sometimes even now, even after all this time. She leaves voicemails I do not listen to. She sends messages I do not read. She waits for a response that will never come. I looked at her name on the screen for a long moment. Then I placed the phone face down on the table, picked up my coffee, and turned back to the window. The sun was fully up now, bright and warm and full of promise. I felt no anger. I felt no pain. I felt no need to explain myself or justify my choices or apologize for becoming the woman I was always meant to be. I felt only peace. Sometimes the most powerful revenge is not anger. It is walking away and never needing to come back. That is where my story ends, but I know it is not just my story. So many of you listening right now have lived some version of this pain. You have been the invisible daughter, the responsible one, the person who gave everything and received nothing in return. You have sat in rooms full of family and felt completely alone. You have wondered if something was wrong with you, if you were too sensitive, too demanding, too difficult to love. I am here to tell you that nothing was ever wrong with you. You were never the problem. And it is never too late to choose yourself, to set boundaries, to walk away from people who refuse to see your worth, no matter how many times you prove it. Your peace matters. Your happiness matters. You matter. If this story touched your heart, if it reminded you of your own journey, or if it gave you the courage to think about changes you might need to make in your own life, I would love to hear from you. Leave a comment below and tell me your thoughts. Have you ever had to distance yourself from family members who did not value you? Have you ever struggled to set boundaries with people who took you for granted? What would you have done in Evelyn's situation? Your stories matter just as much as mine. And I read every single comment. If you have not already, please subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications so you never miss another story. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it today. And remember, you deserve to be loved by people who actually show up for you. Thank you for listening, and I will see you in the next one.